Good evening and welcome to the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. My name's Kathy Garretson. I'm one of the curators here. It's our pleasure to welcome tonight's guest, Yance Ford, who will be giving the Les Blank Lecture following this evening's screening, and then there will be an opportunity for a discussion afterwards. It's an important, eagerly anticipated annual event for us to have the Les Blank Lecture. And for those of you who that name doesn't ring a bell, let me just mention that Les Blank was a very beloved local documentary filmmaker who brought regional cultures from throughout the US. We always say he took the side roads. He was never on a main road. And so he brought to life all sorts of cultures, little known, much loved, whole variances, through his warm, lively films. His interests range from Cajun food to polkas, Texas blues to cowboy artists, and much, much more. When he died, we were delighted and surprised to find that he had donated funds for an annual lecture by a documentary filmmaker to keep alive his own field. That's just so like him. And so for us, each year it's an opportunity to hear a filmmaker talk in depth about their creative process. So we were honored and delighted when Yance Ford accepted our invitation to present this year's lecture. Strong Island, which you'll be seeing shortly, is his debut film. He described it as, quote, "the film I needed to make before I moved on to the movies I want to make." And when you need to make a film, that's a very good starting point. It premiered at Sundance. It screened in MoMA New York's New Directors, New Films. You probably know it was nominated for Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. That's just some of the kudos it has received. Strong Island, as you will see, functions on many levels. On the large scale of examining injustice in our culture, and then moving into his family home to look at some of the personal costs of violence and racism, both the individual type of racism and the structural. Ford's film, as you will see, weaves a complex, difficult story about the killing of a Black man. And as we know, many Black men are shot each year, and many families don't see justice served. It is for these and other reasons that Strong Island has been called, quote, "a masterpiece for difficult times" by local cultural critic Ruby Rich. So as I mentioned, Yance Ford will come up to introduce the program. We'll go into the screening, and then he will be back to give the Les Blank Lecture, offered by an opportunity to share your questions, comments, and thoughts with him. So please join me in welcoming tonight's guest, Yance Ford.
Thank you, Kathy, and the museum, the Berkeley Art Museum and the Pacific Film Archive. It's an honor to be this year's Les Blank Lecture, and I'm grateful to you all for coming out this evening. I won't say too much, except that for me, it's an honor to be here, especially because when I saw Les's doc about the making of, Fitzcarraldo, it just reminded me that actually there was someone crazier than Werner Herzog in the world. And it's the man who would dare to make a film about Herzog's insanity. So I was incredibly grateful to him for showing that folly and failure are just as important as all of the other things that happen in the process of making a film. A few other things about Strong Island. People have described it as personal. I encourage you to think of it as intimate. A few people who are filmmakers happen to intersect with issues that are sort of writ large in the contemporary news cycle, but have always been written somewhere in the lives of African Americans in America, and I happen to be one of those people. So I took an experience that happened to my family and tried to turn it into something larger than my family, and I encourage you to think beyond the Ford family here tonight. Finally, there are funny moments in the film. and I encourage you to laugh at those funny moments, because humor is how people survive the stories that we turn into documentary films, and I think it's important to recognize and laugh along with them. And finally, there are no rhetorical questions in Strong Island, and that is the most important thing, I think, to go into watching the film in having in mind. The film is meant as a conversation starter, both between you and the people in the film, you and I, and with each other at the conclusion of the evening. So thank you. I look forward to our conversation. And again, it's my pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you. So for much of the 6.5 to 7 years that we were in production on Strong Island, I was in a situation that looked something like this. The shots of me at my desk were not staged. We spent a lot of time making phone calls and waiting for people to call us back. And ironically, when Detective Hughes calls back, we were eating lunch. And the reason that my DP had to rack focus is because we hadn't checked the focus one last time. So I was fumbling with the phone and trying to spit out my food, which we spared you. So this is actually my living room in the days before the storm. This is actually, that's the last one. So this is Alan Jacobson, the cinematographer behind the look of Strong Island. Alan and I spent hours talking about how to shoot things for Strong Island that I think most people think aren't particularly what you set out to shoot. I don't believe in coverage. I believe in a visual library where all images have meaning. And so this is Alan on the inside of the garage where the confrontation sort of started and where my brother was shot. And what you're seeing here is it's just water vapor. It was freezing. We shot the image of me on the ground, and we shot the stain from the ceiling of the building 3 days in November. We had a heater running on the inside of the garage, and when we opened the garage door to get the final shots, most of them didn't make it into the film of me standing in this sort of doorway playing my brother. There was an incredible rush of cold air into the space. And so that swirl of mist at the end of the film, where Kevin is talking about self-defense, that's the moments after we captured that shot. Kevin and I had I think probably the most intimate of interviews between all of my subjects and I. This sort of black void in which my character is shot, the one where I'm in extreme close-up. The reason that there's no context to where I am in that shot is because that darkness for my character represents a kind of introspective private space that when presented to the audience becomes a kind of sharing of processing of questions and information and memory and regret, etc. in real time. No one knew what I was going to ask them in advance of any of their interviews, and I never knew what I was going to be asked in advance of any of mine. My interviews were shot over the period of 6 years, 6.5 actually, and I think there are 5 total of the extreme close-up look, and 2 that had different looks that didn't make it into the film. But you'll see a few things here. Kevin in my private space. This was our 3rd and final interview. And for the doc wonks in the room, JT Takaji taught me everything I know about sound recording. And because I'm a nervous sound, because I know that you can fix anything without the picture, but you can't fix anything without the sound. So everyone here is triple mic'd. You can see there's a boom here. There's a boom here. Each of us have lavs, and then there are actually mics hidden above here as well. So I was not going to lose any sound, and actually, the red shirt interview was a real payoff because for some reason the sound recordist pumped a reference signal back into one of the cameras, and so it killed one of the booms, but thankfully the other mics picked it up. When I am sort of sitting in that contemplative space, reading letters, reading my brother's books, etc., using my brother's tools, this is what it looks like. And so part of the production of Strong Island and being both a director and a subject of the film was to engage in a type of pre-direction, where when I was being interviewed, I would say things like, "If I tell you to cut, ignore me," or I gave license to the people who interviewed me, one of them being Jocelyn Barnes here, the producer of the film, the other being Rob Moss, and you guys probably know Rob from his film The Same River Twice, and many others. He teaches at Harvard and was an advisor on the film. So that's me, that's JT here, and there are lots of mics that you can't see. And Alan is ironically very tall and still needed to stand on an apple box. And you'll see this also for the dock bonks. This is his version of a jib arm. This wooden L-shaped bracket, which is attached to a gobo head, or whatever. Sorry, the tripod fluid head is something that he built when he was at Tisch. So this piece of wood is 20 years old. And he has kept it in sort of pristine condition, and this is just his mini jib. And you can see that our sticks are on, a dolly. It's Alan again. So, for those of you who are curious about what it looked like to shoot me from the opposite side of the wall, which I have yet to talk about, Alan and I were really meticulous about keeping the look of my interviews the same. And so one of the things that we always did was have these screenshots. We have thousands of screenshots of every setup, of all of the camera settings. And this is where, he sort of on his side of the camera, and you can see he's got a little light here because soon this room will be plunged into darkness. This is how he maintained a constancy of frame by always having the previous shoot's screen grabs available for his review. This is our second pass at shooting the photographs, and I say second because I shot the initial photographs before I lost my mother. And after she died, I think probably the number of photographs tripled in number. And so we went back, and rather than handling them as evidence, which I had been doing for years, my producer suggested that I handle them with care. And she's the person who's taking this picture. She's the white-haired person in the previous picture. So this is our first shoot with a 4K camera. We only shot in 4K when we reshot all the photographs. This is me in one of my plaid shirt extravaganzas. And again, this is how I spent many hours simply. This is a very simple setup. It's Chimera, Ari, I think it's a 350, and me, and that's really as complicated, and our porta jib, excuse me. And this is what it's like to be in the middle of meta data, meta experience, meta storytelling. I'm looking at myself, look at my notes, I'm looking at myself, look at the transcript of what I said in this interview. I could tell you exactly when, but I can't zoom in close enough. But this was the edit experience, sort of in a nutshell, on Strong Island. It got very, very, very meta. So everyone was referred to by their initials and not by their names. Interviews were referred to by the color of the shirt that the person was wearing: Kevin green shirt, or Kevin white shirt, Barbara red shirt, or Barbara gray shirt. My sister was only interviewed. We only used one of her interviews, so LF was always LF. And then it was, my interviews were organized by date and by the depth and darkness of the bags under my eyes. You can tell the earlier shots from the later ones. And I think I have one more for you. just do it backwards. This. So this is, sort of an example of anybody who's interested in our, sort of camera settings here. It's got all the wonky stuff. And essentially, my interviews were approximately, so the B card is empty because we've already shot A and B, and we've cycled back the third card into the A slot. So we are in the, 2, 4, we are in the 6th hour and 1 minute mark of that interview day. So that was an average day for us. It was 6 to 7 hours of interview time. And so that being said, I'm going to turn this slideshow off, and maybe we can bring up the house lights and continue the conversation. Oh, you can still see that. So, Strong Island, a few factual things, I think. Because we are in an age of digital streaming services competing with cinema, quote unquote, and I think that content creators are being lost in this discussion, especially content creators like me. Strong Island, as you can see, was funded by almost every nonprofit foundation that funds documentary film. The Sundance Institute, Just Films at the Ford Foundation, John D. and Catherine G. MacArthur Foundation, BAMPFA, Fledgling, Field Division, Cinereach, Chicken and Egg. I could go on and on. I say that POV is a co-production partner, as well as the Danish Film Institute and TV2 Denmark, the public TV station. I say that to preface my talk because I think that there is a prevailing wisdom or perception that everything with the Netflix original documentary branding or with the Netflix ident must have been commissioned by Netflix, when in fact this film was paid for over the course of 10 years with the generous support of people who were incredibly faithful in me and the team and had no other reason to be than our determination to make a film that they would be proud of. We were picked up at Sundance last year by Netflix, but the dialogue that's going on about streaming versus cinema, I think, misses a few things, and then I'll go on to why Strong Island is on Netflix. It assumes that everyone has access to cinemas that play films like this, and I think that there's a real if we are to be honest. We think that cinema is a communal experience and one that everyone can afford, but it is not. If you went to see Black Panther, you probably spent close to $20 per ticket. And for me, the economics of that choice does not work. And the reach of public television into communities of color specifically, and into poor communities, and into urban communities, was not enough for me. Having worked 10 years inside of the public television system, I needed to make sure that the people who could benefit most from this movie would see it. And so our PBS co-production partner, POV, made an incredible sacrifice. And though they remained co-production partners on the film, they agreed to allow us to give Netflix the exclusive rights to the film. And because of that incredible participation on their part, and the part of the Danish Film Institute and TV2 Denmark and others, we are having what is kind of an explosive, broadcast, quote unquote. The access to the film has been multiplied by a factor that's, I think, beyond my comprehension. I do know that the film is available in 23 languages, subtitled for the hearing impaired, and that kind of reach was incredible, and incredibly important to me. And it goes to the intention of the film, which is to honor and reflect back to audiences the things that they have been saying for decades, for generations, about the experiences of Black Americans with the criminal justice system, and to affirm that, and to really say, no, you're not making things up. Yes, when you say it, it happens, and if it's real, it's not paranoid. And then to show folks who might not be familiar with this experience on this intimate a level what it means to actually live with injustice, what it means to have a district attorney call the person who shot and killed your unarmed loved one to the stand during the grand jury proceedings, which are wholly controlled by the prosecutor. That choice in and of itself is enough to indicate to almost every former ADA I've seen in film festivals around the country that something was very wrong from the beginning of the case. And so, with that knowledge, and with the challenge of making a film about a story that was 15 years old at the time that I started and 25 years old by the time it was released, how do you make that urgent? How do you make it resonate? How do you shut out the sickening and ever-present tide of social media and web-based streaming of the deaths of Black people? That is just some of the questions that I was dealing with when making the film, and I figured out a way through Strong Island with a kind of intentional filmmaking, one that focused on what I've started to refer to as personal archaeology, which is to be obvious about it, just sort of digging through the past to find where and how far and how striated the levels of family and history and narrative go. And it turns out in my family, like I think many Black families, that the racialized violence that I lived through when I was 19 going on 20 was not actually the first incidence of racialized violence in my family. And my grandfather having been allowed to suffocate in a colored waiting room in Charleston, South Carolina in 1944 was the first instance. And when you hear, the question toward the end of the film, dredge the river and you will find him, or someone who could have been him, that is a direct reference to all of the other people, all of the other Black people, known and unknown, who fall along that line of racialized violence. Whether they are inside my family or not, they should be named and remembered and known. And those 200 people who were discovered in the search for Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, I don't know if they've ever been identified, but 200 bodies were recovered during that search. And that was 1960. That was in my mother's lifetime. That was when my mother was in her early 20s. So it's not that far ago. It's not that long ago. The intentional inquiry. In other words, asking questions that have meaning, asking questions of consequence, asking questions that had answers that I'd never spoken before. Asking questions of every person who sat down with me, and asking first and foremost for them to trust me with their stories, to trust me with their vulnerability, and also to be intentional with that trust. And to understand that when you ask someone to tell you about the thing that they have been haunted by for 15 years, and when your first overture to that person is a FedEx letter, when they call you back, you owe that person something. That person for me was Kevin. He had lived many years thinking that we blamed him for my brother's death. Of course we did not. He didn't shoot my brother. But as a documentarian, as a filmmaker, approaching someone with whom you have a complicated relationship requires care and the kind of consideration that makes or breaks relationships between directors and their subjects. And so every single person in this film, gave me their trust, and I repaid their trust with an intentionally putting myself in the same position that they were. So as I said, I never knew what was going to be asked of me. I simply showed up and answered the questions as honestly as I could. I did not get a break from the camera. I did not get to excuse myself if I became emotional. I essentially had to experience the questions like my subjects did, and the kind of authenticity that we were able to achieve with my character and with all of those characters is because what you're seeing is a record of very, very intimate conversations that happened over many hours and in some instances many interviews. And also intentional execution. Strong Island is what I like to refer to as a constructed film. The look of the piece was set in place before we began principal photography. I shot and tested with several cinematographers. I was introduced to Alan Jacobson by Marshall Curry, a filmmaker who's a mutual friend. And Alan and I, spent hours talking, and then we were really able to set and maintain over the course of many, many years the look and feel of the film. I managed to fit into the same shirt and not mess up the blue undershirt. I got it wrong once. I had two shirts that were similar in color. I should have thrown the wrong one away, but I kept them both. And on one interview day, I wore the wrong color blue undershirt, and that's the only time you can really tell, unless you're tracking, how tired I look, that I'm not actually on point, on task. But everything is deliberate. The placement of the characters within the frame are deliberate to give them kind of authority and reliability that you don't often see in documentary film. Black characters almost always have someone who comes in and authenticates their experience for them. The black characters in this film are the source of their own authority, and that was a very important choice for me to make cinematically. Because when you realize that you have seen black women like my mother, most often in an extreme close-up, perhaps crying, perhaps praying, perhaps in church or offering some sort of forgiveness or redemption or a chance at redemption for the white person who has committed a grievous injustice. I wanted to make the point visually that was not what was going to happen in this film. And my character at the beginning says, something very blunt, and that my editor put there without my knowing, and he surprised me one morning. We worked from about 7 a.m. until 6 p.m. every day, 6 days a week. And it says, if you don't like, that I'm going to ask these questions, you should get up and go. And the invitation to leave this experience was also very important and very intentional, because it's not a film that traffics in the belief that, innocent victims deserve justice or due process, or that there is such thing as an innocent victim. And it also displays what kind of casual yet unshakable inaccuracy sort of is the foundation of the narrative of some police investigations. Because my brother did not survive that encounter, hopefully you realize at a certain point that the only person who could have told Detective Hughes what happened on the other side of that garage door is the person who had his freedom at stake. And so when you hear from Detective Hughes, you are, in essence, hearing from the perpetrator. And that lack of investigative language, for example, when he uses the phrase, William came at him, or, there are lots of other, phrases that are loaded. William was a big guy. He was an intimidating guy, even though what he has described is essentially the first of two instances when my brother was at the garage. March 19th was the vacuum cleaner incident. And if it weren't for the authority in his voice, and I think because of the authority in his voice, you may miss the fact that what he essentially describes is my brother making a fool of himself. He picks up a car door and threatens to throw it, and the damsel in distress asks him not to, and so he puts it down. He picks up a shop vac, which is something that's used in industrial spaces and workspaces to suck up gross water, and guess what? It opens up and drenches him to a point where he has to lie to my mother about where he's been. So there are nuances of storytelling here in Strong Island that are also meant to make a point. And the lack of imagery of the person who took my brother's life is also deliberate. Because unlike many films in the crime, in the true crime genre, Strong Island is not so much interested in the perpetrator as it is in the aftermath of that person's actions and the way in which certain perpetrators are treated and the way in which certain victims are actually treated as the perpetrators of their own murders. So the last thing I'll talk about, and then I invite your questions and conversation, is authorship. Strong Island is my first film, that's true. But I spent many years very seriously studying photography when I was an undergraduate and sculpture. And I did so because I knew that when I got out of Hamilton College, I was not going to go to graduate school. I couldn't afford to. I went home and I got a job and I went to work. But I was always serious. And I think that one of the things about the extreme close-up of my face in the movie is to have the audience have to talk to and look at and be closer to my face than it's actually possible for you to be with the naked eye. And to engage in that seriousness and that lack of apology for that seriousness and for the line of inquiry and the authorship of the film in a way that I think is uncommon and hopefully conveys the final point that I'll make about the film is that risk is not actually proportionate to reward. For me, risk as a filmmaker is in proportion to your intention. And we took risks with this film in order to get as close to my intention as a director as I possibly could. And I think that when we are going into anyone's story, into anyone's home, into anyone's community, that it's important as filmmakers that our intentions be clear. So with that, I welcome your questions. And also, the music is Ray Charles, and it's really loud for a reason.
So as usual, we have ushers on either side with microphones, and if you have a question, a thought, or anything you would like to share with Yance, if you could wait till the microphone gets to you. And do we have any questions or thoughts? So in the middle right there to start.
Thank you for the film and for speaking about it. I wanted to ask you about one of the most powerful things for me is the pacing and the rhythm of the film and the way in which it gives time for people to look and to listen, and the ways in which the emotional intensity is produced through the rhythm of the film. Mm. And so, but it also is a kind of rhythm that is challenging as well. So I wonder if you could talk about how you were thinking about the rhythm.
Sure. The edit process of the film is one that's kind of a crazy story. I got to a cut that was 2 hours and 45 minutes long. That had a very different rhythm, very different pacing to it. It had a lot more verite footage and a lot more of and a lot less of me. And then after my mother passed away, and I realized that this had to be the film that I couldn't make without her. Right? I had to make the film with what I had, which was 3 interviews shy of what I had intended to shoot. So the pacing and the challenge in the film for you as an audience member and the structure of the edit is elliptical, right? So each time we return to the garage, we learn something new. It's essentially, it was an editing technique that my editor, my producer and co-producer, and we sat in our edit suite and we talked about all the different ways we could tell the story. And then we talked about the way that we should tell the story. And that return to the garage each time, that series of ellipses, and the time that we give you to absorb the information that you're hearing is all very deliberate. It's actually, one of the things that got talked about in the edit was what I wanted the film to feel like. And I wanted, on some level, the film to feel like the experience, right? Which was one of waiting, one of ambiguity, one of not knowing what was necessarily going to come next, and being unable to make that prediction. But I also wanted to have the feeling of, for lack of a less graphic description, I was determined to make a film that felt like having your skin peeled back, because that's the thing. That's the thing that nobody tells you about these true crime stories, is that the people who are left when the cameras go home are left like skinless, right, exposed, and so the waiting and the uncomfortability that I hope is a result of that waiting is what we could do as filmmakers to bring you as close to that experience as possible. Thanks for the question.
I don't know if this is really a question, but I was really struck by that comment your mother made, and I think I'll paraphrase, but it had to do with how she felt she failed you by teaching you to look for character rather than color. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
I don't know, just talk about that. That was very sad in a way, but I didn't know quite exactly what she, like, in other words, you better go through life remembering your color.
Well, no, actually, what she meant when she said that was that you have to go through life remembering that the white person that you're arguing with could very well take your life. And, for her as a black woman to express what I think many in the black community feel, which is that, King's aspiration of, a society where you're judged by the content of your character rather than the color of your skin is far, far, it's far, far away from us. And, we're talking about a murder that happened in 1992. And I think that's one of the most courageous things I've actually heard, a character in a documentary say, because that, is the sort of one of the principles of liberalism, right? Like, we should be judged by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. And ultimately, is one of the great failures of liberalism is that we don't have a society where that's even close to being true. So my mother saying that she failed us is essentially my mother pointing the finger at America and recognizing out loud that America has failed. And I respect her for that.
Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your work and speaking so intensely and thoughtfully about it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about masculinity, which is also another thread that runs through the film very strongly next to blackness and race, because we see you show us all these black men dying, right? And as you say, the one thing you were never able to tell your brother that, was to share with him your queerness, the fact that you did not fit into this black girl's role. And so I wondered if you could talk about that as something that was, how present was it for you? What was your thought process around that?
Sure. Gender identity, masculinity, toxic masculinity, those are all, themes that are very present in the film and deliberately so, though they are on some of the sub-frequencies that, where you have to, have text in conversation with subtext. The subtext of my brother's relationship with me is really wound up in masculinity and in expressions of masculinity and emerging masculinities. And also in the film, there's the articulation and the demonstration of black masculinity in my father, who went off, every night for 24 years and worked underground, and who sacrificed, his relationship with my mother to educate the three of us, and what it takes and what it means for for that choice to have to be made by specific fathers in specific places and communities in the country is part of why it's there. And also, the masculinity and the toxic masculinity that I think really sort of touched off the conflict that resulted in Mark Riley being so afraid that he had to shoot my brother. The truth is that my brother was at that garage twice, and the first time he made a fool of himself and Mr. Riley, and the second time he lost his life. But the buttons that get pressed and the taunts that get used. When Detective Hughes says they were calling him a little girl, that was the stroke that for him that was the straw that broke the confrontation's back, and that's ridiculous, but it's legitimate in the eyes of law enforcement, and it's as legitimate now as it was then. And the question of who has to obey whom, I think, has a lot to do with masculinity and also has a lot to do with race and the intersection of those two, right? So often you hear in these videos, that people have to comply or that they have to stop resisting, and the insistence on, compliance and the insistence that people submit to a greater and more dangerous form of masculinity that is sanctioned by the state to take your life is also part of this film, because those same people declined to value my brother's masculinity. He was the threat to their common masculinity. But I also think that, as far as my character and my brother, he made that phone call, and it's an important moment and sort of probably one of the most revelatory for my character in the film. That's the kind of phone call that you make to your little brother. And I had the kind of reaction that I did because I felt on a level that I couldn't articulate then. And there's an interesting thing about the lack of spoken language versus intuition and what we know on a nonverbal level that I think could warrant some discussion. But I treated that phone call like it was from like I was his younger brother. I reacted to it like it was something that I cherished, and to this day I cherish, because I think that he, even in the ways that it was problematic and juvenile, it's still the way that brothers bond. And so when he made that call to me and affirmed what I felt but could not put my finger on, that was a huge moment in the film. And yeah, we could talk a lot about Black masculinity and the fact that it's dangerous for forever, but we know that conversation. Thanks for the question. Any filmmaker questions out there? Any wonky filmmaker questions?
Hi. Thank you for the film, and it was really nice to watch. And I was really intrigued, like when the interviews were happening, how it would fade to black, and I thought that would be the end, and it would switch to a different panel, but it would come back, and the conversation would resume. Mm-hmm. Could you speak about that?
Sure. So there's no coverage in any of the interviews. And that was a deliberate choice on my part. I'm not a filmmaker who believes in using B-roll. I don't think that there's such a thing as B-roll. I think that all images have meaning, whether we want to admit them or not. And so we dip to black in between cuts. And there's one that's sort of pretty early on in the film, because my mother is taking a year and a day to make her point. My mom was a very eloquent woman who spoke at her own pace and would not be rushed. And so instead of covering that shot, I dipped to black. And my editor said, "You're crazy." And I said, "We're not using any coverage." And so that's really where those blacks come from. And they also, after a while, like everything in the film begins to accumulate. And it becomes like a kind of breathing, right? And we actually use breath in the sound mix and in the sound design and in the score. So, you begin to have this kind of, inhale, exhale, coming up and coming down off of daylight and, the blue sky after the interior. So there's a lot of play of dips to different color, black being one of them.
Thank you for the film. I had a question. I had a couple of questions. One is about the importance of photography or the still image and how it plays into also, it seemed to me, even the moving image in a way. So I'm really interested in that. And the other question I had was about around like intention. I guess it's difficult. You were talking about like the liberalism that your mother was recognizing, and I'm just wondering about the intention with this film, because it brings so much to light, but it's also just very it's just visceral, and it's just a kind of like, yeah, I don't know if hope can act, if that's what can be necessarily drawn from it. In a way, I wonder if you find some hope in it,
Do I find hope in the film?
or in what could come from
Or in what could come from
the
the film?
viewership.
Sure. I do. I won't go as far as to say that I find hope. What I find is an opportunity. I think that the film presents different questions to different audience members, and I think it presents, one set of questions to everyone. Right? When I said at the beginning of the film that there were no rhetorical questions, it's because I hope what Strong Island will do is to motivate us all to remember that, there is reason is required in, justifiable homicides. When you say something is based on reasonable fear, we have to actually start demanding that, people ask, well, what's reasonable? Not reasonable for you or reasonable for you, but what as a society are we going to decide is reasonable? What is reasonable fear? I have been afraid for my life, for my safety, for my partner's life, for my partner's safety, many times. I do not carry a gun, so I did not have the choice of shooting anyone. Right? Would I have been justified in any one of these circumstances? I think not. And especially in a state that's a duty to retreat state. Right? So there's also the element of self-defense where you have to ask yourself, well, why did this person, if they were scared, engage in a further conflict? Why did they make their presence known? Why did they exit the car? Why did they, advance toward, etc.? I mean, that, those are questions that I hope we take from the film collectively and ask about these things that we see on the news. Because that's where I think that the film can do the most work, is to remind people that all sorts of things can be felt as reasonable for the person who, is sort of living in a state of racial paranoia and racialized fear. But that doesn't actually mean it's reason. And so that's one of the things that I hope will come out of it. And your other question was about intention, is that right? And the influence of photography and still photography is really evident in the film, both in the framing and the fact that the camera only moves 3 times when it's on the ceiling of the roof of the garage, when it's tracking from right to left in the interior shot, and then the reverse tracking shot in the pink room. There are 3 instances where the camera moves. The rest of the frame in Strong Island is fixed, and it allows the motion and the activity to happen within it. And it also references what you can't see, right? So what's outside of the frame in the film is as important to me as a director as what's inside of the frame. And, my photographer influences include Gordon Parks, obviously, William Eggleston, obviously, and Gregory Kurtzman and not Lorna Simpson, Carrie Mae Weems, and I could go on and on. But yeah, you're right in that, and also the photographs themselves, right? The reason that I don't pan and scan them is that I think that photographs are objects and artifacts, and so I try to treat them like that as well.
So there's a question right there. The person's supposed to say a question right here. So 1, 2, 3.
Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful film. I have a question about one particular scene where I think right after you hung up the phone after the conversation with the detective, that conversation was never really addressed, and you instead chose to focus on the emotions you were feeling after that conversation ended about the vacuum cleaner and the extreme close up of you like screaming into a blue towel, if I recall correctly.
Yep. Otherwise known as my sweat rag, but yes.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, what was the thought process behind that decision, and why focus on the emotion instead of addressing the rhetoric that was being used by the detective, or what was being talked about in that phone call, but instead you focus on the emotion you were feeling at the time. So thanks.
Sure. It wasn't a decision. What you see there, and you can tell from the one of the photographs that I showed you, that was an honest to God affirmation of something I had feared was true for many, many years. And one of the moments in the film where you cease being a director, and you sort of live in real time the consequences as they are lived in your life as the sibling of this person who was lost. I could not have decided to do anything else in that moment. It wasn't cognitive. I mean, it wasn't. It was guttural. It was instinctual. It was, I think, the appropriate response to the content of the rhetoric of the detective, because there was no way to argue or debate someone who, has explained to you that a vacuum cleaner is what cost your brother his life. There's, that's sort of obvious in the scene, and so what I thought was important about having that scene in the film, and it's difficult for me to watch it. I don't like watching myself on camera. I thought it was important for two reasons. One, because it is as authentic a moment of my character's rage as you'll get in the film. There's one or two other moments of sort of expressed rage, but that's one of them. And second, because it gives you a sense of how close the camera person was to me. When you notice Alan, sort of rack focus, you realize that there's another person there. And it wasn't until that moment where, we're cutting between two cameras, but you don't necessarily think that there's somebody there. There could have been any kind of setup. And so what, that having that scene play out as it does also sort of emphasizes the proximity of that character to the material as well as to the people who are making the film. Because, any DPs in the room will know that, if you're on that lens, you probably have a sense of the distance between the camera and your subject, and you realize it's not that great. So that's why the scene plays out as it does. Yes, ma'am. You can ask me, I think.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. Thank you. It's the second time I got to see this, so thank you. And I appreciated what you said about Netflix and making this as accessible or as many opportunities as possible to see it. I was wondering how important it is to you for people, especially white people who work in law enforcement, to see this. Anyone from DAs to probation, parole officers, police, anybody who might be working in that system.
Yeah, we're focusing on a few things in the educational rollout of the film, which is very informal, and anybody who wants to show the film anywhere, as long as they don't charge admission, in an educational setting, they certainly can. I'm focused on a new generation of district attorneys. I'm focused on a new generation of lawyers and getting to them when they're still in law school. I'm focused on using Strong Island to train the trainers, right? I don't think that, outside forces are going to change police culture. I think that inside forces have to change police culture. And I think that means that we have to find leaders who are willing to become police officers and who we will support in their efforts to enact structural change. We could talk about police unions and the powers that they have, and the sort of slippery line between civilian control over police departments and the seeming amnesia that happens when police do things, and our civilian elected officials are sort of like, well, let's talk to the chief about that. It's sort of like, nope, let's talk to you about that. So yeah, I intend to use the film to try to educate as many people as I can about the consequences of what it means about what it means when you arrive at conclusions before you've gathered evidence. What it means when you confuse your job with someone else's job, right? The police. And I hate to sound like the beginning of Law and Order, but the police are charged with investigating crimes, which means that their duty is to, obtain all of the evidence, to safeguard that evidence, to collect it without bias, and to present it in full and total to the DA. The DA has another set of responsibilities. I think everybody needs to be reminded of what they are. So that'll be the long tail of the film and how it lives.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to see this tragedy that your family went through.
Thanks.
I have a question about some of the details of the film. There were a lot of cues, I felt like, or clues in the film that maybe this guy who killed your brother wasn't just any white guy, that he was somehow connected to something more dangerous, something your father said about wanting to protect, to maybe not pursue justice because he wanted you to be protected. And Kevin saying, these are dangerous people, you don't want to mess with them. The limo pulling up at the scene, and I'm just, I'm wondering, did you find out more, or am I reading right what I was thinking as you were going in those different directions?
Thanks for the question. So I know exactly who was in the limousine. I know, the family that owned the shop. I know who they are. And you can Google them. And the detective says, the offhanded comment about Tom Daytree Jr. has been in the news lately. Have you seen it? And he was in the news because he dumped hundreds of thousands of tons of toxic construction debris all over the park, where I learned to swim when I was growing up, and created an environmental catastrophe in that site and two other sites in predominantly Black and Latino towns. So that's why he was in the news. But what you're getting at, I think, is the problem, in that people, I will say, I think that it's difficult for white America to understand that the scale of impunity and, whiteness equaling impunity is actually not, sort of like a, huge scale. It's not the boogeyman, right? It's very benign. It's very ordinary, right? The folks who get away with these crimes are not special. They're not connected. They're not mafia. They might be knuckleheads, but they're nobody. Honestly, in the ultimate scheme of things, Mark Riley is nobody, except a white man. And so what you're picking up on, all those clues that you're picking up on, are the subtle reminders of the power of whiteness.
Thank you for answering that. And just one other small question. Did your younger sister go into law enforcement?
No, but she is in public service, and she's very happy.
So thank you for this film. I really very much enjoyed it. And I grew up not very far from that area in that time. And watching this film, there was a lot that went on in that part of the world during that time. There was Central Park, there was Bernie Getz, there was the Central Park jogger, there was just so much that was happening. And it caused kind of a dissonance. I think there was an incredible dissonance of kind of walking through the world and then watching the way the media portrayed victims and people who are perpetuating crimes. And I think it's not a question, although you can comment. I just very, very much appreciated this film because it's almost a resolution of some of that dissonance, because it's a story told from your perspective about something that is so insidious and was so prevalent and still is prevalent, but made such a big impression, I think, for just what was going on in that time. But it was told from your voice, and it was told in your words, in your family's words, in a deep, deep, meaningful way that the New York Times just could never pick up. And so many films, or not films, but stories and articles talking about the history and the victims and the tragedies of those times just never were able to capture. And so I think this is just very, very important for it to be told from this kind of a perspective, and I have such great respect for it.
Thank you. I almost always, and to my great surprise, have at least one person from Long Island, or from, like a town very close to Long Island, or multiple people. But see, it's just like, why? How did you get to Berkeley? But good for you. So thank you for that. I think that there were less than 3,000 words written in the local paper about my brother's murder. He was killed 2 weeks before the Los Angeles Rebellion, after the Rodney King tape, which was probably the first time, except for the Zapruder film and maybe one other, that everyone in America looked at the same piece of footage and came away understanding something different, right? And that understanding was split straight down along racial lines, right? Black people saw one thing, people of color saw one thing. Other people saw, something else. There must be something else, which is what people said about the two guys in Starbucks in Philly, and now we know about the percentage of people who get arrested as pedestrians in that corridor of Philadelphia, and there's nothing else but blackness happening there. The reason I think it's really important, and thank you for saying so, that the film is told from this side of the experience, is because of something that my producer, Jocelyn Barnes, put really well. She said that personal filmmaking is the language of the dispossessed. And in the absence of any, sort of semblance of justice or due process or attempt to rectify a great wrong, right? Really, the only thing I have left is to make this film. The only option that there is to tell the story and to reclaim the narrative, and to take it back from, this precipice of essentially disappearing Black people. I brought my brother back from that edge. And I think that the importance of telling these stories from inside of the communities that are most affected by them, and from the vantage point of the families that live through them, is because that's where the justice will come. It will not, in my lifetime, be delivered by the system that we have in place in this country. But reclaiming the narratives of the lives of our dead ones, I think, is the most important step, one of the most important steps that we can take. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the Berkeley Archive, Pacific Film Archive, for having me, and for the Berkeley Museum. Thanks for coming.